thank you, and thank you for coming. Thank you for being here and sharing the excitement about this book that I wrote. So the title, Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts, the title is a play on a classical Chinese expression, seek truth from facts, a phrase that famously Mao had used, but that instead Deng then took to use Mao to fight against Maoism, which we'll explain a little bit more later. The hiding facts piece is a little bit simpler. It's simply that in pursuit of rapid development, many facts were hidden. So the kind of, to give you the bottom line up front, the basics of this story of this book, if you have to go, it's late in the afternoon. The questions that the book tries to answer are twofold, kind of in broad terms. How did a revolutionary communist party come to justify itself through GDP statistics, of all things? And why is it shifting away from doing so? And so these questions, the kind of like the simple, the one sentence answer that I came up with that summarizes some of the claims of the book is that a few numbers came to define Chinese politics until they did not count what mattered, and what they counted did not measure up. So the center transformed an ideological movement into a pragmatic growth-promoting machine by limiting its vision of localities, that is local governments, to just a few numbers, and kind of producing excellent performance on those numbers, as faculty worrying about students and their grades kind of can sometimes do. By pushing a few percentage points on an exam, people will do the extra credit, although I didn't offer extra credit here, so not a lot of my undergrads here today. Elsewhere over time, these externalities kind of that from you, when you push a particular set of numbers, the externalities that come from pursuit of those numbers show up elsewhere: pollution, corruption, and debt. And they became what mattered, too important to ignore or paper over. And then what was counted didn't measure up in two different ways. First, falsification, juking the stats, cooking the books, faking data, but also that the numbers were moving in the wrong direction. Growth, if you're in a growth-promoting machine and growth is no longer as fast as it used to be, that's not a great business to be in. Growth was slowing. And so one way that I talk about this, this shift, the transformation, is a neopolitical turn that is both a fix and a hedge. Xi Jinping kind of seeing the problems of this system and what it had produced, China engaged in kind of a shift in its politics that you've been reading about in newspapers and the media over the past decade, and that I talk about as a neopolitical turn. Both a fix, with the thought that if corruption is slowing down growth, then perhaps anti-corruption can fix the issues and promote growth. Similarly, improving governance might fix concerns revolving living standards. And so perhaps what can happen is that the situation can be fixed, growth can be returned. On the other hand, there is another possibility that this is not actually going to be resolvable. And so the neopolitical turn is both a fix but also a hedge, an attempt to move away from the output-based justifications, which makes sense if you feel that the numbers themselves are likely to decline. And so in many ways, the regime is kind of trying to kind of shift the conversation away from just these few numbers of GDP growth towards other types of politics, calling on the CCP to be moral or virtuous in various ways. It's also expanding the set of numbers that matter, PM 2.5, the air quality index on pollution, kind of investigation statistics on corruption, big data initiatives trying to count everything. And yet, the metrics of performance still are present. Under COVID, which ended up kind of rewriting the book in a little bit, also zero COVID became this quintessential number that had to be pursued at all costs until that too kind of was ripped away. So in presenting a book, it's a difficult task to do in a 40-minute talk, and so I'm going to try to set up the first chapter a little bit, tell you a little bit about the structure of this is the structure of the book, but the kind of introduction, the puzzles, what we're trying to do, and then to dive into kind of more of the heart of the book, chapters 6 and 7. So introduction kind of introduces the argument and then develops a theory, as political science books tend to do. Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 then kind of proceed chronologically, beginning with In Seeking Truth, with the kind of the beginning of the reform era in China in the 1970s, the transition away from Maoism towards what we call reform. The aftershocks of those significant changes. Chapter 5 then deals with the ways in which this number-based governance was successful, the extent to which we tell these stories, and they are positive stories, we should not ignore. But over time, those kind of like the successes became swamped by the examples of hiding facts, things that were not going so well. Again, the debt problems, the various other kind of pollution, corruption, what have you. Chapter 7 is a kind of a narrative turn towards looking at the ways in which Xi Jinping's politics, the neopolitical turn, represents a shift in kind of what was that prior system and a response to it and its failures. And then finally, the book ends talking kind of beyond the Chinese case and what it might mean moving forward. And we'll end the talk similarly talking about where we are in thinking about Chinese politics today. So on March 5th, 2013, Premier Wen Jiabao, or former Premier Wen Jiabao, kind of gave a speech, delivered his final government work report before an audience of thousands of nationals, People's Congress deputies. He had been doing this for a decade. And this speech, like many, in front of these audiences kind of included lists of statistics. He continued at length explicating the administration's successes and laying out the tasks for the future, including of its stimulus policy response to the global financial crisis, such as these projects, 18 million government-subsidized housing units, some were upgraded, reservoirs were reinforced, kilometers of new rail lines were built, roads, airports, and shipping berths. But at no point in time were any individuals named or mentioned until his final sentence, which included a reference to the leadership of the party's Central Committee with Comrade Xi Jinping as General Secretary. So when Xi, 6 months later, then visited Hebei province, the contrast could hardly have been greater. In those intervening months, local party and state officials had been on the receiving end of thousands of public comments and criticisms. The litany of complaints and failings served as the basis for dozens of self-criticisms. The title, I think this is South China Morning Post, was like kind of sweating on the verge of tears. The drama was real. Over 2 days in 4 marathon democratic life meetings, officials on the verge of tears admitted their failings to Xi. And these were not just kept in private rooms, but were broadcast on Chinese Central Television for all to see. And one of these in particular struck someone like myself, who's been following Chinese politics for a while, to think about and kind of reflect on a little bit deeply. So Hebei's top party official made admissions of carelessness, laziness, and bureaucratic thinking, and then apologetically added, "I cared very much about development speed and economic volumes, but not as much about people's own interests." For a Chinese local official to care too much about GDP growth, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about economic volumes, feels oxymoronic after decades of statements and reports like the one that Wen Jiabao had delivered just a short time before. The public relations job of Chinese officials seemed mostly to entail standing in front of audiences of party members and talking about rapid GDP growth. These numbers were the principal face of Chinese politics to the citizenry, investors, and the outside world. An explicit attack on the quantitative metrics of success and performance that had dominated the discourse, especially in the context of open, emotional displays of conflict within the party state, points to serious changes in Chinese politics. Indeed, these broadcasts were but one of a series of similar public presentations introducing a new normal, a neopolitical turn to officials, people, and the world. And it's not just this kind of like one example that I'm pulling out and kind of like suggesting is kind of isolated. It is kind of a real turn in the language of the party, and not just in language, but also in practices. But so this is an example of the rise and fall of what I call GDP supremacy. So this is People's Daily articles with GDP in the headline, I think. And so we have this kind of trajectory where around 2012 we have this major turn in this from kind of a rising period to a down slope towards the present. With 2008 being the notable example, 2008 being a period in time when most political leaders in most countries around the world were not particularly interested in talking about economic growth given the global financial crisis. So the book has kind of like 5 takeaways, 3 kind of more general for authoritarianism or the discipline of political science, comparative politics, and 2 that are more perhaps China-specific. So the first is that authoritarian regimes endure, but coercion and co-optation alone do not hold them together. The idea that kind of like, of course, compliance and kind of like that the words of dictators do matter, as does they generate compliance from the regime itself. Security forces willing to shoot at citizens, of course, matters, and incorporating payoffs matters too, but it's not just those kind of coercive apparatuses or co-optation effects. A lot of regimes do a lot of work trying to convince the population and the regime itself that continued rule by the regime is in their best interests. Falsification may play a role, but this is not just people being tricked into believing. Second, mass politics shapes elite politics. A dominant perception for many is that mass revolutions represent the major threat to authoritarian regimes. Yet careful analyses of regime survival demonstrate that the principal proximate threat facing one authoritarian regime is not people in the streets rising up, but is instead some other kind of dictator in the wings, a coup in particular. As such, most recent theorizing on authoritarian politics has an elite-centric character, since those are the players that in the end tend to take the end of a regime. But mass politics shapes those elite politics. As Hannah Arendt wrote, neither Hitler nor Stalin could have maintained the leadership of large populations, survived many interior and exterior crises, and braved the numerous dangers of relentless intra-party struggles if they had not had the confidence of the masses. Dictators and the regimes they lead must be cognizant of their support internally and externally to stave off threats. And then when we think about this idea of threats to the dictator, asking what constitutes a threat to a dictator in the first place leads us to consider who, how, and why of a dictatorship. Who is the regime? Is it the dictator, the person? Is it the broader kind of set of or class of people that they represent? How does it rule? And why is it interested in holding power? Political science has understandably focused on the questions and attention on who and how, kind of with many studies separating different types of authoritarian regimes based on who is the leader. Are they a military dictator? Are they kind of a party leader? Are they a monarch? And so that showing distinct politics of those different types of regimes was a major step forward. Similarly, we are awash in excellent books and articles on the financial and coercive tools that authoritarian regimes use to stay in power. But work on ideology and justification has been thinner. Naked self-interest tends to be less compelling than justifications that suggest a broader public or regime interest in the actions being considered. You as a leader, a Chinese elite inside of the inner circle may have like some parochial interest. Your brother owns the state-owned oil company, and so you are interested in making sure that that oil company does well, but that argument is not going to hold as much water as one that suggests something broader for the regime. And so for the kind of like the more specific pieces are quantification and what I refer to for China as limited quantified vision. As a political technique, quantification has significant strengths, perhaps especially for an authoritarian regime. Quantification imparts an aura of objective truth, transparency, and scientific authority to decisions. It digests reality's complexities into a few simple numbers. Quantification appears to aid accountability without democracy by making numbers that we are going to judge things kind of seemingly commonly understood, numerical benchmarks, and facilitating comparisons. Yet at the same time, they are simultaneously empowering the elite that creates the metrics under evaluation and creates those numbers. So quantification is sometimes seen as this democratic panacea, but in many ways it actually ends up being a political tool that is quite useful for the dictator. And then finally, limited quantified vision is my kind of summary of the way that China's reform era, this system worked. Limiting its vision of localities into just a few numbers, GDP, fiscal revenue, investment, produced excellent performance on these numbers and negative externalities elsewhere. So this is the kind of like the overall frame and theoretical kind of like stakes of the book to give you a sense about the characters and the narratives that I try to dive into in the empirical chapters. I want to jump ahead to chapter 6 and talk about hiding facts. This particular quote from Premier Li Keqiang in WikiLeaks I have used over and over, I think because it's so wonderful. Mostly because of that last bit. He said smiling, that smiling that Li Keqiang does in the report that the State Department cables sent back to Washington. He's talking about GDP figures which are man-made and therefore unreliable. All other figures, especially GDP statistics, are for reference only, he said smiling. So the idea that the Chinese officialdom does not know that these numbers are manipulated or are parts of political games is not the case. They are aware of, and yet the ability to actually do something about this fact, to address the faults of the system, are very difficult to resolve. Organizational design has its limits. Hierarchies like the Chinese party state face what Gary Miller refers to as the fundamental problem of hidden information. That is, superiors require information from subordinates in order to set goals and expectations for those subordinates. This chapter focuses on the system's downsides, its blind spots. Control of the information environment is a prerequisite to these kinds of politics. If you have a free and open media that can discuss whatever it wants and feels free to kind of talk about problems, then these kind of like the ability to hide facts to the extent that they are hidden in the Chinese system during this time would be much more limited. But because of desires for political control, that free media did not arise. And so the kind of I go through lots of different pieces. Those of you who are familiar with kind of like Chinese politics or China over the past few decades, those of you who visited China will be very familiar, at least over a decade ago, with this kind of image of kind of Beijing in 2013, an air apocalypse. The local air pollution is so problematic that you can't see the buildings across the street in front of you. But pollution is just kind of one of the obvious negative externalities of rapid growth and of China's rapid development. Local protectionism is something a little bit more parochial, but if local officials are promoted because of their local economic activity, well, then they might be particularly interested in protecting their activity as opposed to selling those goods to somewhere else. So they want to build the factory in their county, their province, not sell the cotton next door. And so at various points in time, or especially earlier in the reform era, you literally had commodity wars, like cotton wars or silk wars, where kind of like the cotton producers didn't want to sell the commodities outside of their borders and would set up police and keep the kind of the goods inside, and there would be the smugglers trying to get around and receive payment for higher prices that they could get next door. So this local protectionism has both kind of like real negative consequences, especially earlier in the period, but also lends towards the problem of overcapacity, that if every county is trying to build its own factory, its own brewery, because those are the kind of stakes of the game, then you're going to get at a system level kind of overcapacity in ways that are very inefficient. You can see this in particular in the kind of the idea of ghost cities, where you have excess development of particular urban areas, but this that are empty. So this image from Lanzhou area in 2016 is one of my favorites because it kind of juxtaposes this idea of kind of like, for me, of false futures. I don't know if any of you are unicycle riders, but I just don't think this is the future. And so similarly, the buildings behind are unlikely to be the future of Lanzhou, despite their kind of like their eminence. So, but at the same time as this kind of new empty construction is happening, the workers building them and kind of like feeding these construction workers are living in the hovels on the left side the road here. So this idea, for me, in particular this image, but I think the general idea of slums and ghost cities and their juxtaposition is all about who is counted and who is not counted. GDP is counted, and so we will build empty apartment buildings because once I move on from my mayorship to some other job in some other place, the debts that will be kind of like were needed in order to build these will go away on someone else's problem. Whereas the people, the workers, are not necessarily counted in these numbers, and so they are not treated and not cared for, not participating in the system to the same extent, not incorporated into the city. So these other issues of debt and corruption, again, are ubiquitous if you follow Chinese politics at all. Falsification is kind of how I got into this story, and some of my initial work, which I'll present, was on falsification and GDP falsification. So Zhu Rongji, who's a very eminently quotable Chinese leader, kind of said, I quote him all over this chapter in particular. He said, I once said that when you do economic work in China, you should not put too much trust in figures. And so there's lots of examples of falsification. Falsification is kind of, again, the quintessential idea of hiding facts. This is industrial accident data. So at various points in time, what we're trying to show is that there is some kind of evidence of manipulation in the data. And so what you often see in kind of like when you have natural data in lots of different ways is that you tend to have kind of Gaussian normal distributions for a lot of types of events. So that is kind of you have a few kind of like some small events, some lots of medium events, and kind of like a few larger events. And what is particularly interesting is when you see kind of real breaks in the data around a cut point. That is, if you're not allowed to go any further than this without punishment, and there you see this rapid drop off. And so this is kind of the ceiling of kind of the amount of industrial accidents that are particular, I believe these are provincial level data, from 2005 to 2012, kind of like, and provinces were allowed to have up to that kind of that ceiling that they had. And so you have kind of what looks like a relatively normal distribution. And then at that ceiling level, you see a complete drop off, and you see very few accidents at that ceiling or slightly above, suggesting that there is some manipulation of that data. And then the most kind of the quintessential the statistic, the economic statistic of interest for Chinese officials was GDP. And so this is the way I got into this, and this is actually a graph not from the book as much as from the original paper that I wrote about this, called Juking the Stats, from a line from the TV show The Wire, which was a long time ago. And just for all the graduate students out there, don't name your papers based on TV shows because they age very quickly, and so people don't remember them, and they can't, what is the name of that paper? And they forget, and they just find somebody else's paper instead. So title your papers clearly. So this should have been called Falsification, not Juking the Stats. But anyway, I had my moment. Anyway, so Juking the Stats, the idea was that in Baltimore, the cops juked the statistics, that they were measured based on their statistics as well, and so they would kind of like shift down crimes so that major crimes were kind of minor crimes, and minor crimes were not measured at all. And so that idea that, and then the line goes, Juking the Stats is how like captains become, or like how corporals become captains or something like that. That's how promotions happen. And so in China, we have similar dynamics. The Chinese GDP data has long been seen as the kind of like quintessential economic variable that local officials need in order to be promoted. And so what this data is trying to show is that there are kind of patterns in economic data that look like they are separate from economic reality. So that GDP data looks particularly high at moments of political turnover. When there's a new leader coming in is the moment when GDP data kind of jumps above what it looks like it should be from various kind of baseline numbers, like electricity data in particular. So if we take that difference with electricity data, there's this extra bump that you get at moments of political turnover that seems to only happen in moments of political turnover. And is in this kind of upward direction, kind of juking the stats, making things look a little bit better. So a 1 in that top kind of like row suggests like, so instead of reporting 10%, reporting 11%, which is the type of thing that you want to do, right? You don't want to report 30% growth because that's obvious and detectable, whereas a 1% a slight upward adjustment might put you ahead of your neighbors, your competitors. But that paper was kind of an early piece of this work. And this the second piece is with a co-author who's now at Columbia, and Junyan. He and I kind of like talked about informal ties in information. So he is someone who thinks less about the information side of politics or the kind of like formal systems of promotion based on numbers, and more about the informal networks of officials. And so he kind of prefers this type of quote: "A good general must have close confidence to extend his knowledge, sight, and influence. Without such people, one would be acting in darkness, walking into danger without knowing it." And so what we think is happening, kind of these informal networks can actually align incentives between lower and higher level officials and lower the pressure to meet quantified targets. They can complement the formal systems and reduce falsification. That is, because we have a network of officials and I'm likely to get promoted because Eli and I know each other, this kind of aligning of incentives lowers the pressure for me to falsify statistics because that might get both of us in trouble. And so it lowers the pressure and kind of aligns incentives in order to reduce falsification. And again, falsification is this very difficult thing to study. So I tried to study it by looking at differences in GDP growth versus kind of electricity usage. Li Keqiang, in that quote where he smiles, talks about kind of like bond data or kind of bond data or loan data and railroad data and electricity data. And so we used this to create a falsification index. And occasionally in the past few years, there have been examples of cities and provincial level units that have had exposures of falsification. They have been kind of like, they have officially acknowledged falsification in their data and the leaders have been punished. Usually it's not just falsification of data, but other things that have happened. And in those cities, we do see lots of falsification in our index. There's only 4 of them, and so we don't have like great statistical properties there, but we do see overall there is this kind of like downward effect that in other provinces that don't have these examples of falsification, we don't see this kind of high level of falsification. This is a really difficult kind of regression analysis that political science books need to have. The book has 2 regressions. You've seen both of them now. So I can simplify and tell the story a little bit because in one way to think about this story is to think about connections. Well, maybe people that are politically connected are just different than those who are not connected. And so one way that we think about this is that we know that there are people who in the future, because we're looking back in the past, we know that they will be connected, and so we can see their futures. And then there are others who are actually connected already at the moment of kind of we're assessing falsification. Those who will be connected look like they have systematically higher falsification rates than those who are actually connected. And so in that sense, it's not kind of people that are selecting into connections that lead to this pattern, but the actual connections themselves. Happy to talk about that more if there are questions. So this idea that kind of like China's economy is kind of like, this is problematic, that these negative effects are significant, is not just something that was new to Jeremy Wallace here in Ithaca. This is something that the Chinese officialdom understood as well. Even back in 2007, kind of Wen Jiabao is talking about the 4 uns, that the Chinese economy is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And so you might expect this kind of GDP, kind of like all in on GDP all the way, is kind of about to change in 2007. But then the global financial crisis happens, and we have this moment where kind of an economy and political system that is based on growth deals with real economic crisis. And they fall into relatively normal kind of like procedures of kind of like throwing money at the system in order to try to get growth going again. And in many ways are quite successful, but the kind of, we don't see what they would have done to switch out of those 4 uns, what the rebalancing would have happened in 2007 because of the global political economy. And so what we do see instead is kind of this in many ways, the response to the global financial crisis only exacerbates the scale of the problem. And so what we need to kind of like, what happens is a neopolitical turn under Xi Jinping. And so this is kind of a relatively famous quote, I think, that comes out of right after Xi comes to power. And it emphasizes this kind of like, this masculinity politics. In the end, nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist. That is, no one inside of the party really cared. That is, it's not just cultural changes that Xi Jinping is trying to put forward, but really institutional changes and kind of an attempt to remake the economic model as well. But before that, the idea that I try to really push in this chapter is not just that things, of course, had to go this way because Xi Jinping is the person he was because of his experiences in the countryside in the Cultural Revolution, but instead that Chinese politics at this moment in time was a real moment of intellectual ferment. There were real debates, and things could have gone in a different way. And so in some ways, this is like the lament, the tragedy of Chinese politics, that we have ended up in the place that we have. And so in 2011, we have kind of like this quote, kind of, China's in the midst of a fierce clash between different ideas, and the state of affairs has directly impacted political trends in China that concerns the direction of economic development. It's basic, most basic, this clash concerns the major question of what course the Chinese people should take. The kind of simplified version of this is the cake debate. That is, should we grow the size of the cake? In the US, we say pie. I don't know why it's cake in China and pie in the United States. I'm a pie person myself. Anyway, so Guangdong is the quintessential example of kind of growing the pie, whereas Chongqing is more about dividing the pie and making sure that those those interested in kind of like equality are empowered. And these debates are kind of raging in 2010, 2011, 2012. Even Xi Jinping's first year in office really has this kind of like, and Xi Jinping, when he comes in and people see him as the leader coming in, there are lots of different views about who he was and what it meant. Some said he was selected because he was a careerist and he could be molded and controlled. Others saw a basketball-loving reformer who had charmed Iowans when he visited in the 80s, whose father was heralded as the progenitor of the special economic zones of Guangdong, and whose surviving sister had become fabulously wealthy. Another perspective had places identified with a red second generation that venerated Mao and saw themselves as inheritors of a new empire that they were determined not to lose. And this idea that Xi kind of was always going to go in one way kind of really, I think, doesn't stand up to looking back at the history, that the first year is tumultuous. There's a lot of things going on that point in different directions. I'm not going to go through all of these at this point in time, but just that there were feints and moves in different directions, some of which kind of really did show Xi's kind of penchant for control, and anti-corruption is a dominant theme from the beginning. But that there were a lot of moves that seemed to suggest the beginnings of a reformer, or those who saw that this control was about kind of moving to a new economic model. And in particular, the third plenum, which is this kind of like major moment in the reform era. Third plenum is kind of echoing back to the 1978 third plenum. The economist Barry Naughton said it was a huge, sprawling document, and Arthur Kroeber, kind of impressive document suggesting kind of real economic changes. And the economist Arthur Kroeber said it encompasses an ambitious agenda to restructure the roles of government and the market, getting the government out of resource allocation. And so even in 2013, the kind of like the idea is that like the whole world looked at China with anxiety, sometimes surprise, astonishment, and suspiciously, and they are still confused. Even October 2013, there is real uncertainty. Now we know how this story goes. We know that it ends up being about control, about kind of centralization and various other things, about politics, about control. And we kind of can return to Zhou Shun, who kind of, after pleading mea culpa and self-criticism, still actually gets detained for corruption in 2015, has this broadcast confession where he talks about his fabulous wealth to the extent that he has someone full-time looking after his pets in his mansion, and is sentenced for 15 years in 2017. And so the neopolitical turn has this characteristic of personalizing power in Xi Jinping, centralizing in Beijing, turning to party as opposed to state apparatus or legal apparatuses. It's increased monitoring, increased anti-corruption, increased repression, increased surveillance. the idea of a limited vision, limits are gone, and an emphasis on morality and tradition. And as I said at the beginning, that I think of this as both attempting, and as an attempt, especially at the beginning, to kind of fix, to try to return to growth, to get growth going again, but also at least the beginnings of a hedge away from this growth fixation. Fighting debt and poverty. So the ways that this still happens, though, even though there is this shift towards neopolitics and thinking about politics again, thinking about emotions, it still gets kind of like moved through this bureaucracy that is very quantified. And so there were attempts to deal with the debt problem that was facing and continues to face Chinese localities by increasing their transparency, making debt statistics a hard target, and deleveraging a priority. But in fact, what actually happens is that this only kind of exacerbates the kind of like the financial problems, and we don't actually see real movement. Only in 2020 under COVID and the 3 red lines do we see, or 2021, do we see these movements. Similarly, the anti-poverty campaign is trying to deal with the problem of people being left behind, but is quickly quantified with quotas. If it is an anti-rural poverty campaign, one way to deal with that is to move people from rural areas to urban areas. And kind of so examples of forced urbanization and a very technological approach to monitoring what is going on. And then there is this vision of strength, and that we can see most notably in the crackdown in Xinjiang, the idea that this is about power politics and control. And so we see that, again, most notably in the crackdown in Xinjiang, which I'm happy to talk about if people would like to talk more about what happened there, or what has happened and is happening in Xinjiang. And so the book kind of ends thinking about the COVID crisis. So like probably a lot of the chats in the stacks, examples that have had people that COVID forced me to rewrite the book. It ended up being a major piece of the conclusion, because if you're writing a book about numbers in China, COVID became this thing that you had to think about, or at least I had to think about. And so I kind of dove into the COVID crisis, and I'm happy to talk about COVID politics and zero COVID politics in China. Censorship, kind of like the idea of control of information inside of China and its leakages outside of China. There I got to talk about the NBA, which I don't get to do very often because of the kind of like Daryl Morey NBA Hong Kong protest story. And then China's neoliberalism and neoliberalism's rise and fall. If people want to go in towards a neoliberalism direction, I can talk about that. So when I wrote the book, kind of like you finish a book and then it's done, but time continues because it takes a while for publishers to actually get books in hands of people. And so by the time the book was out, the end of last year, kind of it was already a very interesting time because of the zero COVID failures, and protests were happening, and the end of zero COVID ripping off the Band-Aid, and we have the kind of like massive wave that hits China where probably over 1 million people die very quickly in ways that are not talked about. And now this summer we're talking about kind of you can just Google Chinese economic collapse, and at least this is what comes up for mine. Kind of like there are lots of stories. China's economy is officially fragile. Could it collapse? And I think that's it's this collapsing. This narrative of collapse is in many ways what happens when you try to shift the actual economic model away from what had been working. This kind of like build at all costs. Towards something more sustainable. And so now that it is finally happening, we're getting this interesting narrative as the growth focus is finally shifting away. So with that, I'll leave you with these quotes, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for the talk. Really appreciate it. As you know, I'm a big fan of thinking about the politics of data. I want to ask a question, which is, I think not normally the kind of question that I would ask. So there's the issue of how the politics have evolved, but I also am wondering to take maybe the state a little bit, to be a little bit more sympathetic towards the state, the question of state capacity and collecting data is hard to do. Many states around the world struggle with it. We think of the Chinese state as one that is probably pretty good at it, that has the capacity to do all kinds of things. But I'm wondering if there is some sort of story that you can tell, because I know that there is more historical context here going back to the Cultural Revolution, when presumably the capacity was not great, to a period of time where very quickly collecting all this data actually becomes extremely important. Is there some sort of story about the building up the capacity of agencies that can accurately collect that data, whether or not it is being politicized?
Yeah. So in different versions of the book, there were that kind of like the real growth of the statistical apparatus in terms of its kind of how many people and who is working there was more of a focus. The final version of the book doesn't have too much of that. It instead focuses on numbers as this kind of like equilibrium political decision that this is something we can all agree on is moving us forward. So there's more content about at the origins of this kind of like reform era, not who are we going to hire and how many auditors and so on, although there's a little bit of that. It's more about we need to talk about concrete statistics and numbers in order to actually improve the people's lives and in order to stay in office. And also, importantly, to kind of like make things fair amongst ourselves. So with lots of turnover inside of the political apparatus and the officialdom, a lot of old retirees, a lot of who had been brought back, and then kind of a new generation in the Cultural Revolution, those populations, how are they going to get paid? How are they going to, who's going to get promoted, who's not going to get promoted? Kind of numbers and quantified politics were a way to keep that relatively fair and at least kind of objective and transparent internally, even if everyone knew that there was games being played with the numbers. At least we understood what those numbers, what those games were, as opposed to something more opaque or more kind of like networky in ways that could be dangerous and cliquey, given the Cultural Revolution politics. One of the interesting facts about the actual auditing systems is that there is an acknowledgement, and this goes to the limited piece of limited quantified vision, is that there's an acknowledgement that they don't have nearly enough auditors and inspectors to make sure that the companies are being honest and transparent with them. And the kind of like the agents kind of acknowledge this, and that the way we're going to solve this is by letting the businesses do the reporting for us, and we'll trust their numbers. And that kind of, to me, was indicative that they acknowledged that this was like opening lanes of corruption, but that was still the better path to take, as opposed to some other kind of more controlling path that they wanted to. There was an honesty in about allowing local kind of experiment and initiative being undertaken, rather than, okay, we're going to switch from a top-down ideological control where we observe what everyone says to we're going to do top-down economic control where we watch what everyone does in a factory sense. There was a real kind of like stepping back. Now maybe that is like an it's just a way to spin the lack of state capacity coming out of the Cultural Revolution. But I think that it was sincere in the sense that they, even at moments of acknowledgement, don't kind of like, you don't have any bureaucratic fights saying like, I need more inspectors because they're cheating down in the country, like in the factories, in ways that I think you would, especially at this late date. So I think there was a sense in which this limitation and limited vision into localities was a real political decision that was made, in part because when they did try to control too much, there was resistance, right? Like there were people that really did believe in the kind of collectivist vision, the Marxists especially, and that had been, that it was a dangerous thing in Chinese political history to move away from Marxist paths, right? To take a rightist path as opposed to a leftist one. And so some were very slow and reluctant to move, even though the center seemed to be pointing in this direction. Some people raced ahead, others were more patient and kind of like waiting to make sure that this was actually going to happen before they didn't want to get smashed. So I think that these, like, all of those things point in this direction. I don't know if that's kind of getting at what you have, but I don't, other than there is I think I included still a reference to kind of the Statistical Bureau had an official song that was kind of like to get morale up at various points in time, that because they knew that they were a laughingstock in many ways, and so they wanted to kind of like, I think it was like brick by brick we build the number. Anyway, it wasn't the most exciting of lyrics, at least in my kind of sense, but maybe others found it more enheartening. But I think that there is something. There was a reality to this, and there was an acknowledgement that they knew that the things were problematic, but they still did the work as best they could. And the kind of like the professionalization of the statistical apparatus is something that definitely happens over this period of time, even as examples of falsification continue to kind of like plague the system. But and at various points in time, you see that like when the national number no longer just relies on adding up all the provincial numbers, and they just kind of like deal with that contradiction that the national number, if you add up all the 31 provinces, does not add up to the national number, or if you look at all of their averages or their growth averages, it doesn't work out to the national figure, and that's just because the national figure doesn't trust those local numbers. And so they kind of make kludges like that at various points in time. And I think now in 2023, you do see much more professionalization. Unfortunately, what you're seeing now is the deletion problem as opposed to a juking problem. So data just aren't being released, right? So as Eli well knows, the youth unemployment rate number kind of went viral domestically as well as internationally, and it all of a sudden was just no longer being released, and that's just one of many statistics that is no longer juked, no longer falsified, but just deleted, at least for external consumption. My concern there, the concerns to me are obvious. One, that it signals weakness and lack of confidence, but that also the quality of that data is only going to get worse if it's not going to be exposed, right? Like if you don't actually expose it to harsh treatment, then it's going to be much easier, and public scrutiny, then the incentives or ability to manipulate are much, much greater. And so that's where I'll go.
We have a question from online.
Oh, okay.
This question is from Nina. Jeremy, thank you for your engaging talk about this interesting new book. I'm curious if there was anything that you found especially surprising while you conducted the research to write it.
Probably the pandemic. In the sense of this, like the book kind of began in a way thinking about the successes of this system and its difficulties. That was the initial end point. Xi Jinping comes to office, and my writing pace was slow enough that it became the case that I had to think about the neopolitical turn and incorporate that, and that was the conclusion of the book. And then the COVID crisis happens, and it happens in China, and it happens because of like local incentives to kind of like hide information that end up kind of blowing up and blowing up the world. And so the surprising nature that even in Xi's China, with so much central control, so much, and literally the COVID crisis is like the problem that they prepared for. It's SARS-CoV-2, because China already had SARS-CoV-1. We already had this, a very similar crisis in China, and they built a medical system that was trying to report this exact kind of problem, and this never happens. Problems are always different. It's always a different crisis next time. So to have the same, almost like a very similar crisis, and have that system not work, even in the level of central control that we have in 2020 China was remarkable. And so it became this kind of like point of reflection. It was also like in edits. So anyway, it became this piece of the conclusion of the book became about this new number that was very important, the zero COVID number, and the way in which that ended also was surprising, but that was after the publication of the book. So the kind of like not surprising answer in 2023, but actually at the moment, the COVID crisis really didn't maybe change my answers about what was happening, but showed the persistence of this incentive to hide, even in Xi's centralized China. So I saw more.
Thank you for the fantastic talk. My question is sort of like a response to what you just discussed, the deletion problem of the data. You also mentioned like youth unemployment rate that was recently made available. So I just wonder how you what do you think was the motivation for the government to do this sort of thing? Because when the central government stopped publicizing the data on youth unemployment rate, people assume the worst, right? It seems not to be working for them to build up any public confidence, not just among Chinese citizens, but also to the outside world. What do you think would be the motivation? And also, I have a related question on sort of like the dynamic between the real number or whatever number available to policymakers and the number made public, by the government. Because previously, many people assume, even though the Chinese government is falsifying the numbers, they have some sort of internal reference that is not true, but not that far off from. At least the quality is better. So that's for the policymakers. So we assume that they can make some policies based on the more real, data. And recently, you talk about without public scrutiny, maybe the quality of data even available for them would become worse. And there was one episode that didn't seem to be relevant, but it's sort of related. I think last year there was some sort of meeting. Then Xi Jinping was talking to the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and then they had a weird conversation because Xi Jinping said something, and then Trudeau sort of responded. The translator actually didn't translate what Trudeau actually talked to Xi Jinping, and then Xi Jinping replied with something that Trudeau had no clue what was going on. Because then people may wonder, what data or whatever information is even available to the policymakers.
Yeah. I think this is about trust in many ways, right? That it's a problem of trust and falsification, and deleting data or kind of like making it unavailable ends up kind of also deleting trust. I think in the medium run, kind of not releasing data stops being a story. After a while, people stop forgetting, and there's no quarterly release of that data, and people don't want to write the story like they're still not releasing this data, right? That doesn't kind of like tick back up. So if you can handle the negative press the first time, the initial kind of like, we're not going to release this data, and I think most of the time that they stop releasing data, it just kind of like fades, so no one notices until you look at the aggregate statistics that are released, or the statistical yearbooks get thinner or something. But I have a finance series that kind of just stops after a while. Like it kind of like in my office, I have the books get thicker and thicker and thicker, and then there's just none. And like I was never able to find the subsequent series. And I think that is much more common, is that they just stop releasing numbers and no one notices. When they do notice, as long as they can get past that initial kind of like, kind of things must be really bad, they're not releasing the number, it doesn't come back up again. And so maybe there is some advantage, they think, in that way. I think it's still mostly it's the kind of the rare example. Most of the time it just disappears and no one notices, or only people in the know pay attention, but no one really cares. And so it's not that significant. I think more broadly, though you're right, that this is about trust, that the corruption, pollution, like kind of all these negative externalities, the local hiding, the center didn't trust localities to make good decisions that were good for the country, good for the party, good for the leadership. And that the increased monitoring of localities is all about this lack of control and lack of trust. They want to control more deeply what is happening because they don't trust them. And I think that bled into society. And so you could even, and I think I make this connection in the book, I didn't talk about in the talk, but the kind of social credit system, which is often portrayed as this kind of like understanding everything and kind of quantifying all of society and economic relations, is really a response to a lack of trust in society and kind of like scamming businesses and all kinds of things to try to improve trust. And surely that is in part because of the lack of trust in official data as well. So I think you're getting the dynamics right, and I don't know, and I do think the extent to which the leaders themselves, again, it's very hard to get inside of Xi's mind and what he believes and what he thinks. Does he think he has kind of omniscience about what is happening? Or to what extent does he trust the numbers that he gets? I think I would I would expect someone in his position to understand that these have been vetted and kind of controlled and measured, and this is not like raw intelligence, right? That things have been kind of shaped for his vision rather than kind of like, he's not getting, it's hard for me to expect that he's getting like 20 different perspectives and lots of different estimates about what things are really going on, and he's like kind of talking with everyone and kind of having rational debates. I think it seems much more controlled than that. And so whether that's controlled by him individually or probably stovepipe to him, I think is probably where we are.
So I was going to ask about you talked about how the period in like 2010s, like before and after, that was a period of like turmoil and then like genuine like intellectual debate. Yeah. I'm not too familiar with the cake debate, but could you expand a bit on how like it was like China took the wrong path, and can you elaborate a bit on what the like hypothetical other possibility would have been?
Yeah. Well, so the path that was taken was this very politically controlling path that was kind of state-dominated, party-dominated, dominated in the individual of Xi Jinping. And I think you could have had a variety of other paths, but they could have been more kind of free market, kind of the state stepping back and allowing companies and businesses to step back, the state-owned enterprises to be less involved, the party to be less involved. And so you could imagine something like that, getting the state out of allocating resources or directing resources. You could have imagined something else, like a much more kind of a real leftward path where you get much more concern about workers and their situations, and kind of like a communist party that earns the communist name, kind of like actually using state control to improve the lives of the impoverished in the country in a way that is not kind of limited and kind of seems more for rhetorical purposes than actually improving people's lives. So I think those are just some of the possibilities. And so the main one is like the extent of state control and state presence in society, or political presence in society. And that was a real pivot. But then there's also, okay, with state presence or absence, it could have gone in a more kind of like productivist direction, kind of just building more economic development, which is what we still kind of like had for a long period of time, with focused on exports and real estate. Or they could have shifted earlier, like they are shifting now, finally, it seems like, to move away from real estate. They tried to do that in 2014, 2015, and then they kind of pivoted away from that when things got a little jittery. And so it's surprising. So those are just like some of the possibilities that could have happened. But the main idea that I want to fight against is the idea that this was predetermined because of the man, who he is. Biographically, this was destiny. And I just want to resist that idea. The book does not fully explore what these alternative realities could have been, but I do talk a little bit about different possibilities, different visions of what China could be in that period. So you have kind of more social liberal models, you have more Confucian models, and anyway, so I would commend that section of the book to you if you're interested.
Thank you, Ifan, a PhD student. I have two questions. I think for one is that my takeaway, I think from the book, is that China is moving away from using quantification as a kind of strategy to justify its legitimacy. I get that. But on the other hand, shouldn't we assume that as China moving away from the mode of managing opportunity to the mode of managing problems, the state actually have more motivation to know what's really going on, right? I would assume internally there's a bigger push to get real, better data, for example, on local debt problem. And the first question is that, are we right to assume that domestic, like internally at least, even though they don't talk about it, it seems like the state has more motivation now to get a real data. Because I would assume that when you're growing really fast, it doesn't matter like, how many digits you're growing, like 20% or 22%. But when you're slowing down, when you're managing the problem, it's really, I was urgent to know how much like local debt you have So even though they don't talk about it, shouldn't we assume that there's a bigger emphasis on quantification, on a better quantification maybe? I think another question I would have, similar with this gentleman just mentioned about the capacity problem, because in my research about the Belt and Road, the Chinese lending overseas, my understanding is that before 2020 they don't have a good coordination among the banks. They don't know how which bank lend how much to Zambia, and for example, and even some of the bank itself, it never add up how much money it lend to Zambia. But with 2020 as a shock, I would assume that these banks right now finally realize, oh, well, we have a big problem, and we need to get this data right. I assume the same thing happening in China about local government debt and pollution and so on. But this procrastination and learning, shock and learning, I just want to hear your take. Do you think it's special to China? Because one may argue that in the United States, the 2008 financial crisis, the government and the banks all delayed to the last moment, right, due to the shock, and then they learn. The two questions.
I mean, one analogy that you could use there is it's not a problem, and you can keep on running until you look down, right? You can run over the cliff until you look down, but then you're going to be very careful when you're past the cliff, and you'll be careful. I think there's certainly incentives to behave that way, right? To notice when things are problematic, to pay more attention, to be more careful, to move more slowly and methodically, to be transparent, to improve the quality of the data. That's how I hope I would act if I were a leader of a major organization in dealing with problems. It does not seem to me the way that this organization is acting. Someone once suggested that I need to write the Harvard Business School version of this book, well, what can you learn from the Chinese Communist Party? And I don't think that version will ever exist, because I don't know to what extent it's a great example. Because I don't think that what is happening, because that's not the only game that's being played, right? The only game that's being played is not just we want to solve all the problems and kind of make things better. You're also having internal games of I want to be kind of the favorite, and kind of I want things to go well and be seen as someone who's doing well, or jumping in the direction that the leader is going to go to. And so I think those incentives are mucking up what you suggest would be the kind of rationalist planner, the benevolent dictator type of perspective. And I think that, again, there's also a real difficulty, to get back to a point that Eli made earlier. This is hard. GDP is not real. You can't just go count there's 3 GDPs over there and 2 behind the door, right? It's you're estimating and kind of counting various things. It's difficult to do. You have limited budgets, and that's, but the way that they're actually operating, hiding numbers rather than making them more transparent, kind of limiting media rather than opening it up, is not the way to solve problems. It's not the way to find the real shape of these problems as clearly and transparently as possible. It's a way to kind of hide problems, continue to hide problems.
Well, with that, I think we should wrap things up, and thank you very much, Professor Wallace.
Thank you.
And everyone for